Welcome to InCast. Enjoy Health Education's podcast for dedicated healthcare professionals, educators, and administrators who are passionate about making a difference, encouraging healthy outcomes, and finding innovative ways to engage and empower new families and staff. Here's your host, Debbie Young. She's been a childbirth educator and doula for almost 30 years and came to Enjoy based on her love for educating families.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us again today. Today, we're going to be talking with Henci Goer, and we're going to be talking about the induction question. And the reason I asked Henci to be on my podcast is I have so many questions about induction, and I've been looking through some research, and I've been talking to other professionals, and I just think we need to bring it all together in one place for you guys. So we're going to do that today. Henci, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
When I heard that induction had increased substantially since the 1990s, when I was having my babies, I thought, oh gosh, what is that about and how can we do something about it? But I know as a researcher, you've been looking into the same thing, right?
Yes. In fact, I've started a new series of books. The second book in the series came out last spring, and it is specifically on labor induction. It's called Labor Induction, Why, When, and How. For just that reason, because I'm trying to find the topics that are the most. Well, there's been a lot of heat, and I was trying to shed some light instead.
Well, I sure appreciate that. And Henci, I've known you for a long time. I always say I'm as old as Moses. We probably haven't known each other since Moses, but
right.
pretty close. And I know you're an award-winning author. You are a research analyst, which is why we want you today, an advocate for maternity care reform. And those two books are part of that process, right?
Yes. The new series, the new series is really trying to reach out to pregnant women and birthing people to help them make the decision that's right for them. In that, the place I'm coming from is I don't want to make assumptions about what is right for everyone, but the problem is that people are not getting accurate, complete information from their care providers by and large. And there's research to back that in terms of, what did it used to be called? The childbirth surveys that were done over the past few years. There have been several of them published.
Childbirth Connection and things like that.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Those surveys showed that people were not getting complete, accurate information on topics like induction from their care providers. They were getting the reasons why they should do it and not a balanced picture.
Were you involved in the Childbirth Connection studies?
No, not at all. But I've certainly, it's like, I think of myself as sort of strolling through the gardens of research and gathering the blossoms and just assembling them into bouquets for the people who will then make use of them in their work.
Well, we appreciate
I don't do research.
Well, because sometimes reading research is difficult for me. I have a master's, but reading research, I have to be so dedicated to it in my life. I just don't have a lot of time. So people like you and writing the books that you wrote really are helpful, I think. So I was flabbergasted to find out that nearly half of all the labors involve induction. Now, how did we get here? That's a crazy number.
Yes. And it developed over time. It was sort of a long-term process. Back in the day, well, actually, if you go back too far, then the whole thing was to do elective inductions. And it was called daylight obstetrics. You may go, I don't go quite back that far, but It kind of directly preceded sort of that was in the 1950s, um, and then they discovered that inducing labor actually increases cesareans. So it kind of went away for a while. But then what happened was that you had inductions, for medical reasons. And those absolutely, we have to have some of those. But there began to be this new class of inductions that fell between convenience, I'd like to have my baby on a Thursday. So kind of traditionally, induction has been for medical indication, like you have high blood pressure. And then there's always been a category of elective inductions for convenience, inductions because you want to have the doctor in the practice that you like, whatever. But over the years, this third kind of gray in between category developed that I talk about quite a lot in the book that I call precautionary induction. And that's a situation where there's nothing wrong right now. Your baby's healthy, you're fine. But we're going to induce you because something could go wrong in the future. So if we induce you now, we can avoid that. Or at least avoid the consequences of that, which would be to, improve outcomes and decrease cesareans. So the first one that became prominent and is still prominent today is the baby is getting big. In other words, you're fine, but if we let this pregnancy keep going, that baby's going to get too big, and you could you'll need a cesarean, or the shoulders could get stuck. So let's induce you next week. The other thing that kind of developed over time was this idea of, originally overdue was at 42 weeks. I'm sure you and I both remember that. But then it was like, well, these long pregnancies, sometimes, things can go wrong. And then, and as those weeks creep on after your due date, there's more of a probability that something could go wrong with the placenta or your baby. So let's induce. So the first thing was induction got moved back to 41 weeks.
And that was a fairly long time ago, right?
It was a fairly long time ago, but it kind of developed into, let's think about that, to it became, and that's the other thing, there's a creep where it starts off as an elective induction, and then it becomes a medical reason to induce. And at this point, it's become that. Again, in one of the chapters, I dig into all of the issues with the studies that conclude that, we should be doing that because perinatal mortality goes up. And it doesn't increase cesareans. Neither of those are true. That's in the book. But anyway, it crept back to 41 weeks. It ended with 39 weeks. And I know we're going to get to that. But again, there was this backward creep from 41 weeks was now like, we got to get that baby out. It's a medical induction. And then it sort of was like, well, gee, maybe if we induced at 40 weeks. And then came the ARRIVE trial. The other reason to induce, which again is kind of preventive rather than actually needed, is, your membranes have ruptured and labor didn't start. So we're going to induce labor. And again, I talk about that in the book. And the interesting thing about that is and the reason we want to induce is because now that the membranes are ruptured, you can become infected and your baby can become infected, and that can be quite serious. Except what the research shows is if you don't do vaginal exams or put fetal monitoring or whatever into the uterus, guess what? You don't see an increased infection.
But I do.
So it's iatrogenic.
Yeah, I do have to say that almost every pregnant woman that I've talked to lately says, "Oh, if my water breaks, I have to go right in." They are told that, they believe it as gospel. They're afraid of that infection risk that has been told them without hearing both sides of that story.
Right. Or even that there is another, I don't think that that the obstetricians themselves understand that it's their own actions that cause the problem.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's in the book. And that brings us. So in other words, the whole thing is sort of based on this: pregnancy and birth are dangerous. Pregnancy is dangerous in so many ways. So the best thing we can do is protect your baby by getting the baby out by inducing labor. You can see where this is going, because I know we're going to talk about the ARRIVE trial. The interesting thing about this is, up to the ARRIVE trial, we're still talking about subcategories of pregnant women and birthing people. The person who's thought to be carrying a bigger than average baby, or their membranes have ruptured, or they're sort of pushing up against a point in time where, it might be better to get the baby out sooner. When you get to 39-week routine induction, you're now talking about pregnancy itself being the problem. Mm-hmm. Because to induce at 39 weeks, the magic number of 39 weeks is because if you induce earlier, you still see, even though you're theoretically at term, because you're at term at 37 weeks, you still see increased respiratory difficulties in the baby. But by 39 weeks, that's pretty much disappeared. So now the whole mentality for induction is the pregnancy itself is a problem. So we're going to induce you at the earliest possible moment that it's reasonably safe for your baby. And that's a shift. And the fascinating thing there is that too started out as an elective induction. But within a year or two after the ARRIVE trial, you were seeing commentaries saying that, no, this isn't elective, this is medically indicated.
Yeah. Change terminology to fit what needed to,
and that's how you
be said to get it done.
That's how you get to 42% of labors being induced. In other words, these are, when you look at the national statistics, it's much less, because the national, like if you happen to follow the national statistics that get that get published every year, I think it's in the 20%, but that's because they're including planned cesareans, most of which are, repeat cesareans after in the denominator. If you just look at labors, obviously those aren't going to be induced, right?
Right.
You just look at labors, it's at 42%.
Wow. That's a trick of the light or something that should be differentiated.
Yeah. But at this point, I don't think it would make a difference, because if you talk to the average obstetrician who's going to point to the ARRIVE trial, they're going to say, what's your problem? That's a good thing.
Yeah. So, okay. So that should mean more babies and more moms are healthy and have a uncomplicated birth because of this. Is that happening?
Because they're being induced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So is your question, is the ARRIVE trial right? Is it a good idea to induce first labors?
That would be a good
Because
question.
That's really the one that's on the table right now.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to just spend a moment talking about the other issues, and you will have to go to the book for this. As far as inducing for your for suspected big baby, the research absolutely solidly contradicts that.
Mm-hmm.
You increase cesareans, not decrease them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the problems, and you don't improve outcomes for the baby either. One of the problems with the bigger baby is that estimates of fetal weight are really poor.
Right. Right. Yeah.
But what we do know is if the doctor thinks the baby is going to be big, you are far more likely to have a cesarean, even though the baby's small,
Yeah.
it isn't big, than if you are carrying a bigger baby, but the doctor didn't think so. So
Right.
this comes into the choice to do a cesarean is always subjective. So it depends on what's going through the doctor's head.
Hmm.
So that's inducing for a big baby. So no,
Yeah.
it does not reduce cesareans, and it doesn't
My
improve
last two
outcomes.
clients who were induced for big babies, one was over 10, one was over 11 pounds. The 11-pound baby was 7 pounds, 7 ounces, and the 10-pound baby was 8 pounds, 4 ounces.
Yeah.
So, and you know, we had talked about that earlier, that guesstimate is not predictive because at, later scans just aren't as predictive of the actual outcomes. But, people get to make their own choices, and
Yeah.
they both did. Yeah.
As far as inducing because your membrane's ruptured and labor didn't start right away, I sort of gave the answer to that is that's really only an issue if you're doing a bunch of vaginal exams, and there's research behind that. So if you just keep your fingers and instruments out of the vagina, no problem. The next one is inducing at 41 weeks, and that'll reduce stillbirths and it won't increase cesareans. That one I really have to kind of begin working more deeply into what the research says. But if you read the book, I will argue that it does in fact increase cesareans at first births. We're basically talking first births with an increase in cesareans with induction, because if you've had a vaginal birth before, you're not nearly at as much risk because first labors are more vulnerable um, to these, to things not being optimal. But anyway, and I also dig into why does there appear to be a big difference in perinatal mortality if you induce at 41 weeks. And I'll give you a teaser for that one. The thing is that the systematic review that answered that question that said, oh, there's a big gap in perinatal mortality was asking the wrong question.
You're going to
So,
tell us what you mean, right? Because now I'm so curious.
okay. So the question you want to ask if you induced at 41 weeks, this is the right question. In a modern medical system of a healthy pregnancy, just routine induction, will you reduce preventable stillbirths
Mm.
and neonatal deaths and in a high resource country? But the studies they included inductions that were not in low risk pregnancies, that were not in modern, they included studies from the 1960s, were not in high resource countries. And I don't think you can say outcomes are necessarily comparable if you're in Tunisia,
Apples and apples. Mm-hmm.
right? And it included deaths that were not preventable,
Mm.
and included inductions that were prior to 41 weeks. So you can read the chapter for the breakdown of how that changes the odds. That brings us back to the ARRIVE trial, and shall we get into the ARRIVE trial? And
Sure.
it's okay.
Yeah.
So the ARRIVE trial was a randomized controlled trial of, I think, like 5,000 people, a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And they were randomly allocated. These were all healthy first pregnancies, and the participants were randomly allocated to be induced at 39 weeks or to expectant management. hold that thought because I'm going to tell you a bit more about what expectant management means in a minute. They found out that it didn't improve outcomes. There were equal percentages of babies who were admitted to special care nurseries. But it did reduce the cesarean rate. It reduced it from 22% in the expectantly managed group to 19% in the induced group. So the ARRIVE trial concluded that this was a good idea because outcomes were similar and you reduce the cesarean rate. And as we all know, that was published in 2018. And it spread like wildfire. But here's some of the problems with the ARRIVE trial. I mean, so far that's looking good. You've got a big, well-conducted, randomized controlled trial that came up with this conclusion. So what's wrong with this picture? Okay. Problem number one is the ARRIVE trial was conducted under hothouse conditions. In other words, there was a protocol about how labor should be managed, like how long you should allow for the induction and a whole bunch of sort of like best practice for inducing labor. So the first question is, does this apply in your standard community hospital? And the answer is no, and there's research for that. So for example, the national cesarean rate for low risk first pregnancy, first births is 26%. In fact, I think now it's back up to 27%. The ARRIVE trial in both arms of the trial was substantially lower than that. Remember, it was 19 versus 22%. So that tells you there was something going on in how people were managed in the ARRIVE trial that isn't translating to what will happen if it's out in the community. That's problem number one. Problem number two, and this is the big one, is expectant management didn't mean waiting for labor to start. Expectant management meant you weren't induced at 39 weeks, but you could have been induced at 39 weeks in one day or any time thereafter.
Oh my goodness.
And the ARRIVE trial didn't report the percentage of participants who were induced in the expectant management group. And then interestingly enough, like 3 years later, there was a trial. There was a reanalysis of the data, which did. And it turned out, and this is all in the book, it's actually all in my, in an article I wrote in my resource library on my website. So you can get that for free. In which, first of all, like a third of the expectantly managed group ended up being induced. And no surprise, if in any given week that you were induced in the expectant management group, well, let's start at the beginning. The people who went into labor spontaneously had a 15% cesarean rate. So that was better than if you were induced at 39 weeks. So that was thing number one. If you were induced in the expectant management group, the cesarean rate was like 33%. So in other words, all those induced people were shifting the cesarean rate in the expectant management group higher. And doubtless, I also went into, well, why were they induced? And most of them were induced for post dates. They weren't induced because they developed a medical problem. So all of those, if you were really looking head to head. So that brings us to the third point, which is, okay, do we have another system of approach to first labors? And what were the cesarean rates in those labors? And ta-da, we do, because we have studies reporting on outcomes of first labors in birth centers and home births. And guess what? Remember that optimal cesarean rate for a low risk first labor is theoretically 19%. Well, rates in the home birth studies, which would have been equivalent. In other words, if you were in this study at 39 weeks, you would have been eligible for a home birth. You were healthy. There was no reason why you couldn't have a home birth. Rates ranged from 5% to 13%.
Wow.
So
Wow.
if you've got one way of managing labors that ends with a cesarean rate, like in that range, and another way of managing labors of the same type of people that ends in a cesarean rate that's substantially higher, well, that says there's something wrong with your management, doesn't it? And we also have a fair number of studies now coming out showing that inducing, well, there were a bunch of studies where they looked at analyses of low risk first labors in various countries, and with induction. I guess I can't remember the complexity of what I wrote about, but I do, and it's also in my article as well. There are a fair number of studies that contradict the outcomes in the community of the arrived child and what it could accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the arrived child's been out there, and there is data that is sort of pushing up the induction rate slightly, and there is no evidence that it's decreased the cesarean rate in low risk first labors.
Mm-hmm. So, knowing all of this, and as you said before, many of the people who are encouraged to be induced maybe don't know all of this, but what is driving their willingness to be induced? What's driving that? Is it purely doctor as God, or is there something else there?
Well, I think there are sort of two things. Well, the first thing is, how miserable you are in those last few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So if your doctor says to you, you know what, we can induce you at 39 weeks and it's all good, it will decrease your cesarean chances of having a cesarean, and you can have your baby. I mean, you'd have to be fairly sophisticated, or I've already have a position that you don't want to be induced, or you'll just say, great, doc. There are still so that's one cohort of people who are just happy to hear that they don't have to wait for Mother Nature. Yeah, although it's I don't know if you remember there was a margarine. There was I think it was a butter commercial years and years ago that ended with Mother Nature saying, "It's not nice to fool Mother Nature."
I remember that one.
Yeah. The second cohort doesn't want to be induced or hasn't thought much about it. It's just kind of, willing to go with the picture. And then if your doctor sits down and says, you know what, we can induce you at 39 weeks. In fact, let's get you on the calendar. And because, your baby's ready to be born and you never know what might happen. So, let's just get this done.
So the fear factor may be at play, whether it's let's just get this done, or you have a big baby, or whatever is told to the parent. They're like, oh my gosh, we need to do this. This is, as parent, my responsibility is to keep my baby safe, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that fuels almost everything because, if the doctor said, I'm sorry, but we really need to cut your arm off or your baby is going to die, how many women wouldn't go?
Yep. Yeah.
So, yes, that's where I come in. That's where my piece is. I can absolutely understand, and it's in the book as well, that you might want an elective induction because, for whatever reason, your husband's going to be out of town on a business trip and you want to make sure he's there. I have no quarrel with you. You'll understand that, well, I'll tell you how to have an induction that will minimize the chance of having a problematic induction. But I'm not going to say to you what's right for you. The problem comes in when you don't know the other half of the story.
Right.
Because
Yep. That is the problem. So let's talk about actual risks and the realities of an induction. And as we get started with this, I know you and I have talked before, and bringing this information into the classroom is something that's really important. And I'm going to do a follow-up blog on what we're talking about today and how to bring this to our parents in the classroom. Is that okay?
I would so appreciate that. And let's you and I talk about, can I supply you with maybe, I don't know, a handout, something like
Mhm.
maybe even an
Yeah.
excerpt from the, let's talk about it. I don't want to make any hard and fast decisions, but this is getting close I mean, this is where I come in, is that I see doulas and childbirth educators as carrying the data that I can give them to their clients and students. So I really want to help you with that process.
Great, excellent.
But let's see. So back to um, what
Well,
are the
let's talk about the risks of induction first, and then we maybe can talk about the myths or beliefs that may not be true around induction.
well, okay, let's see where it gets us. So the first one is, well, the first one's sort of psychological, but I don't think it can be discounted, and I don't think anybody's paying attention to this. So the hidden message in inducing labor is your body isn't competent to take care of your baby. That's not a great message to get as you approach motherhood.
Right.
It's subtle and it's terrifically undermining. And it undermines your ability to have a sense of your own confidence and your ability to make decisions. It's basically said, I need to take care of you because you are not competent to do that. Not a good idea. So that's subtle. The second thing is, and this is Dr. Sarah Buckley's work, is what leads up to labor is a dance of hormones between the mother and the baby, where the baby is actually taking the lead and telling the the birthing woman or birthing person's body to be, to get ready. The baby is taking the lead on that. And those preparatory steps help with the body then, with the uterus laboring effectively and also preparing for breastfeeding and bonding with the baby. And those are ongoing right up to the beginning of labor. If you cut that short, even by a few weeks, there is benefit to all of that. That is the major benefit of not inducing labor without a good medical reason why the baby's better off out than in. So that's problem number two. That's a harm of induction, is it cuts short that process. Problem number three is when you are in labor, again, there's a whole bunch of neurologic hormonal information going back and forth between the uterus and the pituitary, and which is deep in the brain, about managing the labor, that it doesn't get too intense, that it works effectively. Well, the thing about that is oxytocin is produced in the pituitary, so it's behind the blood-brain barrier, the oxytocin that's produced naturally. So it gets into the bloodstream and it causes contractions. It has a whole bunch of other functions as well, which also functions that help tolerate the labor. Oxytocin has been called the love hormone because it just makes you feel kind of calm and okay with the world. And yeah, exactly. Now, the problem with introducing IV oxytocin, which is needed in most inductions, is that it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So that means you're not going to get the benefits of the positive stuff. The other thing too is that if the contractions are getting too intense, your body will back off.
Your own
But if you're,
oxytocin would back
yeah,
up. Okay.
exactly. But you're going to override that, especially since a lot of most regimens that hospitals and doctors use for oxytocin are way more than the physiological amount. And that has consequences too. Like, for example, your probability of postpartum hemorrhage is related to how much oxytocin you received over how much time. Why? Because you fatigue the uterine muscle. It just, and so what it does is it stops responding. Guess what? Postpartum hemorrhage. So there are problems with overriding the normal regulatory mechanisms on labor. And then the third one is controversial, and I don't think we can go into it in detail. And that's well, maybe I can at least do a standing on one leg version, is that this idea that that inducing labor doesn't increase cesareans.
That's what we're told. That's what we're told.
Okay, so let's see if I can run through. So the first thing that they discovered which was kind of back in the 60s, was, oh yeah, if you were induced, you were more likely to have a cesarean with a first labor. I'm talking about first labors because, as I said, you're almost bulletproof against a cesarean if you've already had a vaginal birth, so you can be induced, no problem, mostly. But with first labors, it's a different story. Oh, it increases in cesareans. So the first response was, well, no, that's because there are these medical reasons for cesareans that are mixed in. And of course, they're going to be more likely to have for induction. So they're more likely to have a cesarean. But then they did some studies that said, no, this was happening. You were more likely to have a cesarean if it was a first labor, even if it was an elective induction. And then the next response was, oh, no. It was like there were other factors, like they were being induced because it was a bigger baby or other reasons. And the study, then there were a bunch of studies that said, no, we excluded the bigger babies. Oh, okay. All right. Well, the last one was, but now we've developed these ways of ripening the cervix. We have these agents that will, if you don't have a ripe cervix, you have a low Bishop score, if you want the medical, well, we can fix that. And so now it's not a problem. And what the research very solidly shows is that if the cervix isn't ready for labor, you will increase the cesarean rate substantially, even with agents to ripen the cervix. Because the thing is, those agents do a terrific job of softening and effacing the cervix. They don't decrease the cesarean rate. Again, because I think it's a more complicated picture than having a soft cervix. The uterine muscle is involved. There are other things involved. But in any case, here's a tip for people who are considering an induction, or even are looking at an induction for a medical reason. If the cervix is ready to go, the cesarean rate is the same.
Okay.
So that's, let's take someone who's like, their blood pressure's on the high side, and the doctor's saying, I think maybe we ought to do this, would be to have a discussion about how urgent is this? Because if it's not right, can we wait a few days? And that if they can't. But that, I think, is a key point, is that, like, yeah, we get the cervix nice and right, no problem.
Well,
no,
and I think asking good questions is the key to all of these things, which I'll be talking about in the blog.
Yes, and I will say that my chapters all end with something I called your takeaway.
Yeah.
I don't think it's helpful to give people information without telling them what they can do with it. So the takeaway section is always about, so now you've heard this and now you've made a decision. So how do you like maximize your chance of like how do you implement the decision that you've made?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. We need to learn that. We need to learn that to buy a car, to buy a house, and to have a baby. We need to learn that. So.
Yes. Well, at least what we need to do is to apply the same principles that we would to doing those things to who is taking care of us um, when we're having
Right.
a baby.
Right.
We tend to like, oh, my gynecologist, I love him or her. It doesn't necessarily mean they're the right person for to 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 help you with your baby. I will say that it is fine to make the choice that you are just going to take your care provider's advice, but it should be a conscious decision.
And it should be a
Because
shared
it's
decision.
perfectly legit. No, I
Yeah.
just want to say that it's a legitimate way to approach it to say, you know what? I'm going to just take this person's advice.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what happens for most people is they don't realize that they can say no, or that they should find someone who is more aligned with what they like to say yes to. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's an important point. And I remembered what the third point was. The third point was, I think there can be an assumption that if you've got a midwife, you've got a different model of care. You don't necessarily. Or that if you have an obstetrician, you have a particular model of care. While it's more likely you're going to get someone with the medical approach, it's not necessarily so. So you can't go on the assumption based on the label, like obstetrician versus midwife, nor can you go on the assumption of gender, of man versus woman. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a mistake that gets made too.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, not a mistake, an error, just you make
Right.
assumptions that
Right.
are not accurate.
I agree with that. I agree with that. When we're talking about the midwives and the obstetricians, they're part of a bigger system, and that system really isn't set up to necessarily maybe go against what the Arrive trial said, or is it a system problem, do you think?
Yeah, well, it is a system problem at root. It's the there are so many things that sort of point the system in the way that you um, that is self-reinforcing. So
Mhm.
the first problem you have is that let me back up a step. There are two basic ways of approaching care in pregnancy and childbirth. There's the medical approach that starts from the premise that birth is a difficult and dangerous thing. And the best thing that can be done is to monitor very closely, to keep parameters within a narrow range considered normal, and to jump in and deliver the baby or some way intervene at the first sign of a problem, because that's the way to get a healthy baby. And you can see that's our system, right? The other is the physiologic care approach, which is yes, things can go wrong sometimes. And there you're going to, need to do treatment or whatever needs to be done. But like like all physiologic processes, it's going to go right most of the time. And what you need is support and facilitation to help that process go right. That is the diametric opposite of the medical approach. And it has been shown over and over and over again to be the best approach. Yeah, I mean, if all of our children went to pediatric cardiology specialists instead of a regular pediatrician, I wonder how many young children would be, taking medicine for heart disease, or what, it's that kind of model, which the problem is that we have put obstetricians are specialists in the pathology of women. Well, wait, they're surgical specialists in the pathology of reproductive organ, women's of female reproductive organs. All you have to do is say that, and then look at the system, and it makes perfect sense. So that's problem number one, is that the underpinning principles are not ones that match the needs of pregnant women and birthing people. But then you have a bunch of other forces which also are going to push it in the direction that it has gone. And one is defensive medicine. I'm going to do this so I don't get sued. And, isn't it awful how people are suing doctors right and left? To which Marsden Wagner, may his memory be a blessing, said, you know what? If you're going to play God, you're going to get blamed for natural disasters.
I hadn't heard that one before.
It's in one of his books. So there's the defensive medicine, and then there's the economics of it. The most economically effective is a planned cesarean delivery. Right behind it is a cesarean with sort of all the bells and, it labor cesarean, but with an epidural and all the bells and whistles that go with that. So you see a system that is entrenched in this. It's incredibly difficult to change. I mean, it's an echo chamber. It's self-reinforcing.
Right.
I mean, let's take continuous fetal monitoring. It's a failure.
Mm-hmm.
We've known that since the 1990s.
Right.
And it's still the way it's done. What's his name? Neil Shaw.
One of my favorites. Mm-hmm.
Yep. He pointed out that you win either way. So you see trouble, you do the cesarean, and the baby's perfectly fine, and you say, oh, thank God we got there in time. Actually, I'm not quoting him, but he's talked about this issue. So win, right? I should have done the cesarean. You do the cesarean, the baby's born in trouble. Oh, thank God we got there in time. But in both cases, it's like, yeah, we need to do this fetal monitoring. So you've got an echo chamber because they never step outside the echo chamber and see what they're doing wrong. And then there's just the humanity of it. If you had been practicing this way, this was the way you were told to practice, this was the way you were told it was the best way to practice, you thought you were, the people in this game, there's a few bad apples out there and they turn up every, but almost everybody in this game wants a healthy mother and a healthy baby. And now someone comes along and tells you, you know what, you've been doing it wrong. Not only have you been doing it wrong, but you've been doing a tremendous amount of harm. Likely are you, how resistant are you going to be to taking that in?
Yeah, that would be difficult. It would be difficult. And also just the changing, like you put your shoe on the same foot every day. And why? Even asking the question why sometimes is a stumbling block, because that's what you do. You put your shoe on that foot every day. So.
Yep.
Well, certainly we're going to take this information and bring it into the classroom. Certainly we're going to, there are probably some nurses and doulas out there that are going to bring this information into the birth room also. Is there other, the book for sure is a place to go with that. But what other preparation do people need when they're told, oh, we're just going to go ahead and do an induction? Do you have any gems for that?
It's stuff that I cover in detail in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But if I mean, I would imagine that the childbirth educators and doulas are teaching the BRAIN acronym.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so that's what I would go to is, you're entitled to know the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
You're entitled to know the risks. You're entitled to know what alternative things, you can do instead, including waiting, watchful waiting for now. Once you've got the information, I'm going to repeat it just to refresh everybody's memory.
Sure.
Once
Great.
once you have um, the once you've gotten the information and you've processed it, um, you are entitled to consider what your gut is saying, because it's not just about your head.
Intuition is everything.
Intuition and instinct. And legally, you are entitled to say no or not now.
Yeah. Do you know who Jen Hamilton is?
No.
She's a influencer, whatever that means. But she's on a lot of like TikTok and Instagram.
Mm.
And she said the other day, if you were induced and things aren't moving forward, you can ask just to go home. And I'm like, and she's a nurse in a hospital. She has a really good outlook on supporting women and helping them make the decisions that they want to make. But I thought, good for you, Jen. Good for you saying, if it's not working, just tell them you're going to go home. But I think people don't feel like they have the power to say that, and I'm glad she told them they could.
I totally agree, but there's a catch in what she said that I talk about in the book, which is about induction. Often what they do very early in the process is rupture membranes. And if
Don't
they
do
do
that.
that, you can't go home.
Yeah.
So one of the things I say is, if you're looking at an induction and you've agreed to an induction, decline having membranes ruptured, because as long as they're intact, well, I'll reframe that. Decline having membranes ruptured until you're established with strong regular contractions and you're making progress. You're like 5 centimeters or because as long as they're intact, you can go home.
Yep.
Or even just have a respite, like just, we'll turn the lights out, let you get a few hours sleep, and then we'll turn the pit back on.
Oh, great idea.
But that's the sort of, that's why I'm not just about be induced. I'm about make a careful decision. And if you are being induced, here are some strategies that will help it go well.
Yeah. 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 That's why I wanted to talk to you. I knew you had that. So I'm going to just say that, we're going to get this out to as many people as we can. We want people to be able to make informed decisions that are right for them. And with this podcast and with my follow-up blog, I want educators to start putting this information into their classroom. It started kind of as a craze, as a way we could do this, and it's escalated. And so we're responsible for helping it de-escalate, I think, because parents are the ultimate boss. I think they're the ultimate boss. So any additional thoughts around that?
Okay, now I'm going to do a tiny bit of shameless self-promotion.
I wish you would. Yes, please do.
So I really want to speak directly to pregnant women and birthing people, but what I found is the people who are listening, who form the majority of people who are following me, are birth workers.
Mm-hmm.
This book is cheap enough. This book kind of does the work for you. This one and the other book, the labor pain book, even more so. So if you're a doula or an educator, you don't have to get into, sort of complicated discussions with your clients or students. I've kind of done the work for you. One thing you could do is, the book is cheap enough. Like if you're a doula or a private educator, is buy them and hand them out, because then you can say, here, read this. And then they can come back. This is great for midwives too, hospital-based midwives. Then they can come back. They've educated themselves. Now you can have a discussion, if you're a doula or a midwife, about what they would want, as opposed to trying to educate them from the get-go. It also gets you out of the sort of conflict of, your childbirth educator told you what? It's like, not on you. So I'm kind of, that was kind of one way I was hoping to sort of spread the word, or, buy it and put it in your library, buy a few copies so that people can take them home. So it's kind of like, I did the hard work for you because this is my specialty. Now you go forth and do yours. I got you. I'm holding your coat.
Well,
Please, let me, I hate to interrupt. The other thing is, so on my website, I converted what used to be a sort of standard sort of blog post section into a resource library where I took all the articles that I wrote, and on the homepage of the library, they're organized according to category. So it's a library in the sense that one of the categories is obstetrician versus midwife, ? And if you click on that, you'll find all of the articles that I've written that have something to do with comparing obstetric and midwifery care, or VBAC versus repeat cesarean. And that's free. And it's free to send your clients or students to.
And we will put that website on the show notes, so people will just be able to click into there and get right to that.
Oh, please remind me to give you specifically not just the website, but the page of the homepage.
Sure thing. Yeah.
So that's how I want to help, because, as I said, the place I've come from that's been my passion is I want to help people make the decisions that are right for them, and then help them, no judgment, safe space for you to decide what you want to do, and then help you implement that.
And I appreciate that you started out with the fact that, inductions are not evil. They just are misunderstood by many people. And so having all of the information to make that decision one way or the other, whatever is right for you, is important to get that background information.
Yeah, because here's what we know about, this is kind of a bigger picture, but it starts with making those decisions and having a plan. Well, I mean, the subtitle of the books in the Take Charge of Your Birth series are Get the Data, Make a Plan, Take Charge of Your Birth. What we know about what makes for a positive experience is not how difficult or easy it was.
Mm-hmm.
It's two things. One is, were you treated with kindness and respect? The other one is having agency.
Right.
And that's the piece that is very important to me.
Agency or ownership is the way to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And the doulas and the childbirth educators and the midwives and the nurses out there who are assisting their clients, patients, students in having that are doing something really vital, because we also know there's a lot of research about not having agency and not being treated with respect and kindness is the strong link to childbirth related trauma.
Yeah, for sure. So we want to thank all the people who are helping parents gain that agency. So thank you for everybody out there who's doing that. And thank you for being with us today, Henci. Really appreciate talking with you again. And people are going to probably want to get a hold of you. Is that okay? Can we put your
you bet.
Contact information in the show notes?
So you've got my website, hencigoer.com. I am on both Facebook and Instagram with at Take Charge of Your Birth.
Okay.
I think both on the website and and we also run social media about signing up. You can get my newsletters. So there's one in the mid-month that's generally announcing my latest article or featuring an article from my resource library. And then the one at the end of the month is kind of a roundup of items that might be of interest to share.
Good.
Yeah, so
Good.
and then
Well,
it comes right into your inbox.
that'll be nice. It'll be easy. So again, thank you so much for being with us today.
And thank you for having me.
Yes.
This episode of Incast is complete. Tune in regularly to hear more insightful conversations. And be sure to visit enjoyhealtheducation.com to see how Enjoy can help you inspire families and staff through our diverse childbirth and parenting teaching solutions. Or call us at 1-800-326-2082. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the official position of Enjoy or its employees. This podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and does not serve as medical advice, a basis for diagnosis, or recommendation of treatment.